to grease the wheels of America's infant industries. Oil to fuel an explosion of growth. News of the discovery unleashed pandemonium as thousands of speculators descended upon the region. Overnight, wildcatters stripped away whole forests and put up thousands of rickety derricks, hoping to strike black gold. As the oil gushed skyward, fantastic stories appeared of instant fortunes. Among the Cleveland businessmen lured to the region was John D. Rockefeller. He was no wildcatter. He saw that drilling for oil was a very risky business. Refining, not drilling, he decided, was where the steady money was to be made. Soon, a new rail line linked Cleveland with the oil region. Rockefeller built his refinery right beside it. It was one of the first in the city to produce kerosene, a new fuel for lamps that was cheap and clean. The poor man's light, as John D. called it, would bring a brilliant glow into American homes. The soaring demand for it, he was convinced, would make him rich. I shall never forget how hungry I was in those days, he later wrote. I ran up and down the tops of freight cars. I hurried up the boys. Obsessed with the business of oil, he mastered every detail, developed new products to sell. By age 25, his refinery was one of the largest in the world.
He really mortgaged his life up to the hilt. He borrowed tens of thousands of dollars, which is the equivalent, of course, of millions today. He had the strength of this vision that this was where his destiny was, and this is where the destiny of this country was. The country was going to kind of ride to greatness on this tidal wave of oil. And he constantly felt that he would inevitably triumph in some fundamental way.
He honestly believed that he had a calling to make money, and that it was a gift that had been bestowed upon him by God, just as some people could sing opera and other people could paint beautifully. He had a particular aptitude for acquiring wealth, and he considered it a God-given gift.
So many wells were flowing, he lamented, that the price of oil kept falling, yet they went right on drilling. He saw an industry plagued by overproduction, and his own success threatened by what he described as ruinous, cutthroat competition.
John D. was shrewd enough and he was analytical enough that he realized that in order to figure out a way to save his own firm and his own newly won fortune, that he had to figure out a solution for the entire industry. It was at that point that John D. began to conceive of the oil industry as one big interrelated mechanism. And you couldn't just change one component. You had to control the entire machine.
In a move that would transform the American economy, Rockefeller set out to replace a world of independent oilmen with a giant company controlled by him. In 1870, begging bankers for more loans, he formed Standard Oil of Ohio. The next year, he quietly put what he called Our Plan, his campaign to dominate the volatile oil industry, into devastating effect. Rockefeller knew that the refiner with the lowest transportation cost could bring rivals to their knees. He entered into a secret alliance with the railroads called the South Improvement Company. In exchange for large, regular shipments, Rockefeller and his allies secured transport rates far lower than those of their bewildered competitors. Ida Tarbell, the daughter of an oilman, later remembered how men like her father struggled to make sense of events. An uneasy rumor began running up and down the oil regions, she wrote. Freight rates were going up. Moreover, all members of the South Improvement Company, a company unheard of until now, were exempt. Nobody waited to find out his neighbor's opinion. On every lip, there was but one word, and that was conspiracy.
What it really represented was the face of monopoly. It immediately became clear that the entire nature of the enterprise was going to change in ways that spelled their doom. And so there was a shock of recognition that they were going to be left behind and that a whole world that had been opened up to them was soon to close.
The image that was always used was that of the anaconda, the squeezing python-like grips of this economic snake that was just taking individual entrepreneurs and just putting them out of business and reducing them to kind of economic strait where they had no alternative but to really sell out to the principals in this conspiracy. It was a conspiracy, really.
When he moved into the White House, when he became Secretary of State, he brought with him as a consultant David Rockefeller. I've talked to some of his secretaries who say that when Henry Kissinger was out of the office, he would sometimes get called by the President of the United States. And he might also, during that same period, get a call from Nelson Rockefeller. When he returned, he would always call Rockefeller first. He met his wife, Nancy McGinnis, through the Rockefeller. Their engagement was announced not by the McGinnis family, not by the Kissinger family. It was announced by the Rockefeller. They went on their honeymoon in a plane, personal plane provided by the Rockefeller. I've been able to trace one $50,000 payment from the Rockefellers to Henry Kissinger while he was Secretary of State. When he left the State Department, he returned openly to the Rockefeller payroll. He's now chairman of the International Advisory Committee at the Chase Manhattan Bank. I think that background might be interesting when I give you a little history that he does not challenge. He started to. And you might be interested in the little colloquy that occurred. When I called him to ask him certain embarrassing questions on this subject, the high price of oil, he said, Jack, would you show me where you are getting your information? I said, certainly. You come on over, we'll show you what we have and let you respond to anything you wish. He sent his top man, Bill Hyland, who looked at all the secret documents we had accumulated on the subject, and after he did, he shook his head and said, someone must have given you the whole computer printout on this subject. And so we used the story, and there was no comment from Henry Kissinger. What was the story? The story is as follows. In 1972, Kissinger foresaw that we would become heavily dependent on Persian Gulf oil. He also perceived, or this is the way he explained it to me, that the American people would not support a military buildup in the Persian Gulf, not after the sour experience in Vietnam. Though our stakes in Vietnam were nothing compared to our stakes in the Persian Gulf. And so he proposed to President Nixon that we call upon the Shah of Iran to become the guardian, the protector of U.S. interests in the Persian Gulf. And in early 1972, Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger flew to Tehran, and they asked the Shah if he would become the guardian of American interests in the Persian Gulf. He was glad to do it. He had delusions of grandeur anyhow. He looked forward to building up the Persian Empire again. And so he said, yes, he would be glad to do it, provided that we would supply the weaponry that he needed. Nixon and Kissinger told him he had a blank check. He could order anything he wanted, and we would ship it there. And he ordered the most sophisticated weapons in our arsenal. So sophisticated that the Iranian armed forces couldn't operate them. We had to send 75,000 instructors over there and advisors over there to teach them how to run the stuff. Another question came up in April of 1972. This was a logical question. He said, the Shah said, if I am to become the guardian of American interests in the Persian Gulf, and I am to purchase American weapons in order to do so, who's going to pay for them? Kissinger and Nixon said the American people, because of the Vietnam War, would not be inclined to do so. Now, the record doesn't show, the documents in my possession don't show who made this suggestion, but it had to be one of the three. And all three of them concurred. One of them suggested that the thing to do would be to triple or quadruple oil prices and to purchase the weapons out of the proceeds. And in 72, when that meeting broke up, there was a consensus that the Shah of Iran would begin to clamor for a multiplication of oil prices and that the United States would support him. Not openly, but quietly. And he began a campaign. And when he started clamoring for oil prices, I've seen the documents, we got urgent messages from Saudi Arabia. See, the OPEC in those days was dominated by two countries. They were the two greatest oil exporters. The Saudi documents, the Saudi secret documents, happily both Saudi Arabia and Iran were stalwart allies of the United States. And so we seem to be in a good position. And the Saudis, assuming that we'd be concerned, and knowing that the Shah was a megalomaniac and sometimes had these strange visions and made these wild statements, sent us a flurry of messages to assure us that they would not go along with the increase in oil prices, to assure us that they would hold prices down. But they also pointed out that we had placed the Shah in power, that we ought to have enough influence to shut him up. And so they suggested that if we would just shut the Shah up, because he was stirring up all the oil-producing nations, that if we would quiet him, that they would cooperate with us in keeping oil prices down. Well, to shorten the story, we didn't cooperate, because we had this secret agreement with the Shah. We not only didn't cooperate, we quietly allowed him to go ahead until it became so obvious that the Saudis sent us a message saying, well, it's clear to us that you want the oil prices because you would have shut him up by now. And we assume, therefore, that you want higher prices. We, therefore, will be happy to oblige. And on January 1st, 1974, oil prices were quadrupled. There was a howl of outrage across the world, and the loudest ones came from the United States. The one who howled the loudest here was the Secretary of the Treasury, William Simon. Well, the Saudis, when they heard Simon, when they heard others in the United States screaming, sent another flurry of messages saying, we assumed you wanted the high prices. We had offered to hold them down. We had asked you to keep the Shah under control. If you can keep the Shah under control, if in fact you don't like these high prices, we will roll them back. And a very happy William Simon flew to Riyadh and negotiated the rollback. Negotiated it. My friends, it was announced. It was announced in July of 1974. The rollback was announced. Simon told me that he came back and triumphantly explained what he had accomplished to President Nixon. He said Nixon took some notes on a long sheet of yellow paper. But he said he had the impression that Nixon was so absorbed by Watergate that he wasn't really functioning on other subjects. He said the subject came up at cabinet meetings. Kissinger always opposed him. He never understood why. We never did deliver. We never did shut up the Shah. The Shah continued to scream, or to clamor for even higher oil prices, until the Saudis, outraged, having negotiated a rollback, sent us word that the whole thing was off. And they canceled the rollback that they had negotiated and announced. So we not only could have stopped the oil increase, we could have brought the prices back down after the increase had occurred. And we did not do it. Now, I have given you the background of Henry Kissinger. This benefited the Shah, but it also benefited Standard Oil of New Jersey. And that bothers me. And when I raised it with Henry Kissinger, he says, I'm outraged that you would even make the suggestion. He says, I was doing what I thought was best for the United States. He says, I didn't even consider what the benefits might be to the Rockefellers. Maybe so. But it bothers me. It troubles me. The Rockefellers have benefited. The Shah benefited temporarily. And I really am not going to take the time to go into his downfall and the reasons for it, except to tell you that Jimmy Carter inherited the mess, and except to tell you that he made it worse.
You're telling me the whole city was involved in this? In other words, the Port Authority knew exactly what was going to happen here. They were deliberately emptying out the buildings. They were going to bring it down. The whole thing with Silverstein was just a cover story. He invested $114 million. He got $4.4 billion back, and that all went in his pocket. But that was all just for show.
Yeah, well, elements of the Port Authority certainly would have been involved in this. As far as the players and people that were involved, and we really can't, name names, but they, New York Port Authority certainly, is up to their eyeballs in 9/11.
Here's a question. What do you think should be done with the World Trade Center site? And we haven't talked about this because we're so constrained by time, but at one time the buildings were known affectionately as David and Nelson.
Well, that is true that they have been called that. And I think the reason was that when they were built, Nelson was governor of New York and I was chairman of a thing called the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association.
It was a conspiracy, really. It was one of the first great economic conspiracies in this country.
In an effort to thwart the scheme, many independents refused to sell crude oil to Rockefeller and his associates. Undaunted, Rockefeller used the threat of the South Improvement Company to intimidate his rival refiners in Cleveland. His brother and business partner William characterized the plan as war or peace, sell out to Standard Oil or suffer the consequences. At first, they approached their targets with deference and flattery. Rockefeller himself used his own considerable talent for persuasion, presenting Standard Oil as a brotherhood based on cooperation.
He had this missionary faith that he was destined to guide this industry. And when he took over his rivals, he not only wanted their plans, he often wanted the managers. So it was not in his interest to alienate them. He much preferred convincing people to sell to him voluntarily rather than trying to squeeze them through paratactics. Although if necessary, he would resort to very rough methods in order to soften them up, or he used a phrase, to give them a good sweating before he negotiated with them.
Rockefeller might create a shortage of the railroad tank cars that transported oil. He might go out and buy up all the barrels on the market, so a competitor would have no place to store his oil or ship it. He would even buy up all the available chemicals that were necessary to refine oil. Rockefeller instructed Standard Oil men to communicate in code. The company was nicknamed Club. John D. Rockefeller was referred to as Chowder.
And I was chairman of a thing called the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association, which after a study of the area had recommended that something be done to build buildings which would promote trade, which had been the principal source of economic strength for New York for many years.
Almost immediately, the basic premise upon which the towers had been built, the desirability of concentrating trade-related businesses under a single roof, was shown to have little basis in reality.
And we had both proposed this particularly to the Port of New York Authority, which is the organization that owns the ports in New York, the Port of New York, and also the airports. And they did, in fact, build the Trade Center. Of course, our part was one of recommendation, but we didn't really have anything to do with the actual construction.
Many of Rockefeller's targets had no idea that the local refiners who were slashing prices and acting like competitors were actually part of Rockefeller's growing empire. In just 2 months, he had taken over 22 of the 26 Cleveland refineries, revealing the single-minded drive that would make him both the wonder and the terror of American business.
Nobody knew what he sounded like. Nobody heard him. He walled himself off. And the people who did know him, though, the people who did find him ruthless, had reason to find him ruthless, because you come up against someone who has no self-doubts, who has a vision, and who has no qualms about achieving that vision, because he doesn't think he's doing wrong. Once he made his mind up, you might as well sell your company, because it was going to be part of Standard Oil.
Methodically, secretly, John D. Rockefeller was doing more than transforming a single industry. He was changing forever the way America did business. The day of combination is here to stay, he declared. Individualism has gone, never to return.
By 1879, when Rockefeller is 40, he controls 90% of the oil refining in the world. Within a few years, he will control 90% of the marketing of oil and 1/3 of all of the oil wells. So this very young man controls what is not only a national but an international monopoly in a commodity that is about to become the most important strategic commodity in the world economy.
What to do now? I think what is being done is the right thing. There is a new group which replaced the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association, called a Committee on Lower Manhattan, that's headed by John Whitehead, a very distinguished businessman and once Deputy Secretary of State.
I've told people the closest Nelson Rockefeller ever came to being president of the United States. It was like a 32nd of an inch away.